God will restore what you have lost. Biblical truth about divine restoration: there are seasons in life that arrive without warning. Not the kind of season you can prepare for, not the kind you see building on the horizon, giving you time to gather yourself, to brace, to find solid ground before the impact comes. These seasons arrive the way a storm arrives in the dead of night, suddenly, completely, without the courtesy of an announcement. And when they arrive, they do not take just one thing. That would be survivable. That would be the kind of loss that breaks you for a week or a month, and then slowly, painfully, you find your footing again and begin to move forward. No, these seasons take everything: your strength, the deep, interior reservoir of it that you drew from when life was difficult, goes first, so quietly you almost don't notice until the moment you reach for it and find only emptiness where it used to live. Then your peace, the settled, quiet certainty that things were going to be all right, that there was a plan behind the chaos, that tomorrow would make sense of today, that goes next. And without it, the days feel unmoored, untethered, like a boat that has lost its anchor and is being carried by whatever current happens to be strongest in that moment. Then your direction, the sense of purpose, of moving towards something, of knowing why you were getting up in the morning and what you were building with the days of your life, gone. Replaced by a fog so thick you cannot see your hand in front of your face, let alone the road ahead. And then, quietly, almost gently, as though it had been waiting for the others to go first, your joy. Not your happiness. Happiness was never the point. But the deep, soul-level delight in being alive, in being loved, in belonging to something larger than yourself. That quiet, underground river of gladness that flows beneath even the hard days. That goes too. And you stand in the rubble of what used to be your life, and you ask the question that has been asked by every human heart that has ever been broken in the history of the world. Is it too late for me? Say that question out loud. Let it sit in the air for a moment. Is it too late? Because that is the question, isn't it? Not just, why did this happen? Not just, when will it end? But the deeper, more terrifying question that lives underneath all the others. The question that arrives in the early hours of the morning when the rest of the world is asleep and the silence amplifies everything you are most afraid of. Is the damage permanent? Are those years truly gone? Is the version of your life that you hoped for, that you worked for, that you prayed for, is it simply over? And here is where something extraordinary happens. Because the Bible, that ancient, living, endlessly relevant text that has spoken into every kind of human darkness that has ever existed, does not offer you a polite consolation. It does not offer you a gentle pat on the back and a soft word about how everything happens for a reason. It offers you something far more radical than that. It offers you a promise, and not just any promise. A promise spoken by the voice that created the universe out of nothing, that parted seas and raised the dead and caused iron to float on water. A promise from the only voice that has never once failed to keep what it said. In the book of Joel, chapter 2, verse 25, God speaks these words: "I will restore to you the years that the locust has eaten." Read that sentence again, slowly. Let every word land where it is supposed to land. I will restore to you the years. Not, I will comfort you about the years. Not, I will help you come to terms with the loss of the years. Not, I will make you feel better about the years that were taken. I will restore. To understand how breathtaking this promise is, you have to understand what locusts meant to the people of that time. A locust swarm was not a minor agricultural inconvenience. It was total devastation. These were not individual insects causing scattered damage. A locust swarm could number in the billions. It could descend on a region like a living darkness, blocking out the sun, consuming every green thing in its path, stripping fields bare in hours that represented months and years of backbreaking human labor. An entire harvest, gone. An entire year of planting, tending, waiting, hoping, consumed in a single afternoon. And when it was over, the landscape looked like something that had never been alive at all, like hope itself had been eaten. God looked at that. He looked at the total, irreversible seeming devastation of it, at the years of labor reduced to nothing, at the calendar of wasted seasons stretching behind his people. And he did not say, "I understand your pain." He said, "I will restore." Not restore the harvest, restore the years. Do you understand what that means? Years are not things you can give back. You cannot manufacture more time. You cannot reverse the clock. Years gone are, by every natural law that governs this universe, gone. There is no mechanism by which lost time can be recovered. And yet, the God who exists outside of time, who created time as a structure for human experience, but who is himself not bound by it, looks at your lost years and says, I will restore. This is not poetry. This is not metaphor designed to make you feel better about something that cannot actually be changed. This is a declaration from a God who has demonstrated, repeatedly, in the most concrete and documented ways, that he operates by a different set of rules than the ones we assume are absolute. But let us not stay in the abstract. Let us go somewhere specific. Let us go to a man named Job. If you have ever felt like you have lost everything, then the story of Job is not just relevant to you. It is written for you. It is the story that exists precisely for the human soul that has stood in the ashes of its former life and tried to find a reason to keep believing. Job was not a careless man. He was not someone who had built poorly or lived recklessly and then suffered the predictable consequences of his own choices. Scripture describes him in terms that are almost startling in their completeness. Blameless and upright, a man who feared God and shunned evil. He was, by every measure that mattered, a man whose life should have been protected. And yet, in what seems like a single devastating moment, or rather, a sequence of devastating moments that came so fast they must have felt like one continuous, endless collapse, Job lost everything. His wealth, which was considerable, was taken. His livestock, the foundation of his livelihood, the visible evidence of God's blessing on his life, gone. His children, 10 of them, gone. His health, his body, which had been strong and capable, became a source of unrelenting agony. And then the cruelest blow of all. The people who should have been his comfort became his accusers. His friends, sitting with him in his suffering, looked at the catastrophe of his life and concluded that he must have done something to deserve it, that his loss was evidence of his guilt, that the scale of his suffering was, in some way, proportional to a failure in his character. Have you ever experienced that? The loss is devastating enough on its own, but then, on top of the loss, the people around you draw their conclusions, spoken or unspoken, and suddenly you are not only carrying grief, you are carrying the added weight of their judgment. Job carried all of it. And here's what Job did not do, which is just as important as what he did. Job did not turn away from God. He argued, he questioned, he said things in his anguish that were raw and untidy and not the kind of faith we celebrate on our best days. He demanded answers. He asked God directly why this had happened. He sat in the darkness of his suffering and refused to pretend it was light. But he did not let go. He held on to the God he did not understand, with hands that were broken by grief, and he would not release. And then, Job chapter 42, verse 10, the Lord restored Job's fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. Twice. God did not restore Job to the same level. He did not simply replace what was taken, like a merchant settling a debt with the exact amount owed. He doubled it. He gave Job more at the end than he had possessed at the beginning. Because this is the nature of divine restoration that the human mind struggles to fully grasp. When God restores, he does not simply repair. He does not patch the wound and send you on your way. He rebuilds, and what he builds in the place of what was lost is greater than what was there before. Not because the loss was meaningless, not because the grief was something to be dismissed or minimized, but because the God who allows the breaking is the same God who designed the rebuilding. And when the one who made you from nothing turns his creative attention to what has been taken from you, he does not work at a minimum. He works at overflow. But perhaps you are hearing this, and somewhere in your heart a voice is rising with an objection. Because Job got back double in terms of wealth and children and health. But what about the years? What about the seasons of suffering that were simply endured? What about the part of the story that was only pain and no visible purpose? That question leads us somewhere even more extraordinary. It leads us to a young man in the ancient world whose story reads, in some stretches, like the story of someone God had forgotten. His name was Joseph. Joseph's story begins with favor. He was beloved of his father. He had been given dreams. Actual, literal dreams. The kind that felt like windows into a future where he would be honored and significant and used for something that mattered. He had every reason to believe that his life was moving in a direction of purpose. And then his brothers, his own family, the people who shared his blood and his table and his history, turned on him. They stripped the coat from his back. They threw him into a pit. They sat down to eat their lunch with casual indifference while he called to them from the darkness below. And then they sold him, for 20 pieces of silver, into slavery. The dreams must have felt like a cruel joke in that moment. The future he had glimpsed, where he stood in a place of honor and purpose and consequence, seemed not just distant, but impossible. The gap between the pit and the promise was not a distance to be traveled. It looked like an abyss. But the story does not end there. It goes to Egypt. It goes to the household of Potiphar, where Joseph worked with integrity and was given responsibility, only to have that small recovery snatched away when Potiphar's wife lied about him and he was thrown into prison. The pit, the slavery, now the prison, year after year after year. There is a moment in the story, easy to read past quickly, devastating if you actually stop to feel it, where Joseph interprets a dream for a man who is about to be restored to his position in Pharaoh's court. And Joseph asks only one thing in return: remember me, mention me to Pharaoh. And the man forgets. 2 more years pass in prison. 2 more years. If you were keeping count of the years at that point, you might have lost count. You might have stopped counting, because counting makes the waiting feel more real. And sometimes the only way to survive an impossible waiting is to stop measuring it. But God was not counting years. God was counting something else entirely. He was watching what was being built in Joseph during those years. The character, the resilience, the capacity to govern not just himself, but nations. The depth of wisdom that cannot be taught in a classroom or acquired by comfort, that can only be forged in the furnace of extended suffering and delayed promise and the long, dark corridor between who you are and who you were made to be. And then came the morning that changed everything. Pharaoh had a dream. No one could interpret it. And suddenly, at what seemed like the most random possible moment, after years of silence and forgetfulness, the man who had been in prison with Joseph remembered. Within 24 hours, Joseph had gone from the prison to the palace, not promoted 1 level, not given a better assignment, made second in command of the most powerful nation in the known world, given authority over the very geography that had held him captive, positioned in a place of influence so significant that when the famine came, the famine that would have consumed his family, his brothers, his aging father, Joseph was exactly where he needed to be to save them all. And it was then, in that moment of impossible reversal, standing on the far side of everything he had suffered, that Joseph said to the brothers who had sold him into slavery, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Genesis 50, verse 20. You meant evil. Joseph did not pretend that what his brothers did was acceptable. He did not spiritually bypass the reality of the betrayal, the cruelty, the injustice. He named it directly. You meant it for evil. That is a real thing that really happened, and it was genuinely wrong. But God meant it for good. The same events, the same years, the same pit, the same chains, the same prison walls. 2 different sets of meaning operating simultaneously. The human intention was destruction. The divine intention was preparation. And this is the truth that the enemy of your soul does not want you to understand when you are sitting in the middle of your own pit, counting the days, wondering if God has forgotten your name. Every year in that pit was being counted. Every day in that prison was being purposed. Every moment of waiting that felt like waste was being woven. Because God does not redeem your story by erasing the painful chapters. He redeems it by revealing what those chapters were always building toward. But let us not remain only in the grand, nation-shaping scale of Joseph's story. Because sometimes the loss that breaks you is not enormous in the eyes of the world. Sometimes it is something small, something that other people might not fully understand. Something that, if you tried to explain it, might be met with a well-meaning but ultimately insufficient, "I'm sure you'll be fine." And it is for those losses, the ones that feel too small to bother God with, too personal to articulate, too quiet to rise to the level of dramatic intervention, that one of the most remarkable stories in all of Scripture exists. There was a widow, described in 2 Kings chapter 4, who came to the prophet Elisha in a state of complete desperation. Her husband had died. He had left behind debt, significant debt, the the kind that in that time and place carried consequences that are difficult to comprehend from a modern distance. Creditors were coming to take her sons as payment, her children, her future, the last living remnants of what had been her family. And what did she have left? One thing, a small jar of oil. That was it. That was the full inventory of what remained between her and total ruin. Not a warehouse of supplies, not a reserve fund, not a network of supportive relationships to draw on. One small jar of oil. Alicia told her to do something that must have seemed, in her condition, almost absurd. Go to her neighbors and borrow as many empty vessels as she could find. Don't ask for just a few, he said. Bring many. And then go into your house and shut the door and pour. She did. Of course she did. Because when you are out of options and someone speaks with the authority of heaven, you do not have the luxury of skepticism. She gathered the vessels. She shut the door. She began to pour from her small, insufficient, completely inadequate jar of oil. And it did not stop. Vessel after vessel, she poured. The oil kept coming. The small jar that should have been empty after the first container kept producing. It filled the first. It filled the second. It filled every vessel she had brought. And only when there were no more empty vessels did the oil stop. The oil did not stop flowing until every available space was filled. Do you understand what that means? The limiting factor was not God's supply. It was the number of vessels she had prepared to receive it. Her obedience determined the capacity. Her willingness to gather the empty spaces, to make room, to create containers for what was coming, determined how much she received. And from the oil that overflowed from that single small jar, she paid every debt, and she and her sons lived on the rest. God looked at one small jar and turned it into provision, freedom, and a future. Now, if God would do that for a widow's jar of oil, if he would work a miracle over something that modest, that ordinary, that materially insignificant, then what will he do for your loss? What will he do for the thing you are holding in your hands right now? The small and seemingly insufficient remnant of what you thought your life was going to be. There is a second story from the same book of 2 Kings that is so specific, so particular in its subject matter, that it almost seems too small to be in Scripture at all. A group of prophets were working by the river, cutting down trees. One of them was using a borrowed axe. The axe had slipped from the handle and fell into the river, and sank. The man who lost it was distressed, not merely because of the inconvenience, but because it was borrowed. He had taken responsibility for something that belonged to someone else, and now it was gone. In the murky depths of the river, carried away by the current. Iron sinks. That is what iron does. It is one of the more reliable laws of the physical world. And yet, when Alicia was told what had happened, when this small, particular, personal loss was brought to the attention of a man who moved in the power of God, something happened that defied every law governing how the physical world is supposed to behave. The iron floated. God caused iron to float. Not because the axe head was of great strategic importance to the history of nations. Not because the story would become a famous theological case study, but because it mattered to the man who lost it. And if it matters to you, if it matters to the person who is carrying it, who is lying awake at night because of it, who has prayed about it more times than they can count, then it matters to the God who created the physical laws and reserves the right to supersede them whenever love requires it. Restoration is not about the size of the loss. It is about the heart of God. And then there is Jesus. Everywhere he walked, he restored. It was the signature of his ministry. It was what happened, consistently, repeatedly, in case after case, when the power of heaven came into direct contact with the brokenness of human experience. To those who could not see, he restored sight. Not partial sight. Not better than before sight. Sight. Complete. As though the eyes had never been blind. To those whose bodies had been ravaged by illness, he restored health. Full, functional, dignified health. Not management of symptoms. Not improvement. Wholeness. To those whose dignity had been stripped away by disease, by exclusion, by the devastating social and spiritual consequences of being labeled unclean, in a world where that label meant untouchable, he restored dignity. He touched what the world refused to touch. He spoke to what the world refused to acknowledge. He brought back into full belonging what the world had pushed to the margins. And then there is the moment in Mark chapter 3, verse 5, When Jesus stood before a man with a withered hand in the synagogue, surrounded by people who were watching to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. People who were more concerned with the rules of the day than with the suffering of a man standing before them. Jesus healed the hand. But note how it was healed. The text says the hand was restored completely, as if it had never been withered. Not partially healed. Not mostly restored with some residual evidence of the damage. As if it had never been broken in the first place. That is the nature of divine restoration. It does not leave scar tissue that reminds you of the wound. It does not bring you back to 90% of what you were and call that good enough. It restores to wholeness, to the full, complete, original vision of what was meant to be. But before we go any further, there is something essential to address. Because restoration is not automatic. It is not something that simply happens to us while we remain passive observers of our own story. The Bible, in every account of divine restoration, shows us something that the person receiving it had to do. Not earn, not perform, not prove themselves worthy of, but do. The first and most fundamental thing is return. The second chapter of Joel, the very chapter that contains the magnificent promise of restored years, does not begin with restoration. It begins with something far more confronting. It begins with a call to return. Return to me with all your heart, God says. With fasting, with weeping, with mourning. Not because God is demanding payment before he will restore, but because restoration is not a transaction. It is a relationship, and relationships require presence. They require turning toward, not away from. They require choosing the connection even when, especially when, everything in you wants to retreat into your own pain and close the door. Restoration follows relationship. You cannot receive what God is carrying toward you if you are walking in the opposite direction. The second thing is faithfulness in the process. Job did not understand his suffering. He never received a full explanation, even at the end. God never sat down with Job and walked him through the reasons, the cosmic conversation, the stakes involved. What God gave Job was not an explanation. It was an encounter, a direct, overwhelming, almost terrifying encounter with the God who existed before the foundations of the world, who knew the measurements of the earth and the dwelling of light and the storehouses of snow. And in the face of that encounter, Job's questions dissolved, not because they were answered, but because they were transcended. Because when you see God, the questions about God become less urgent. Joseph did not understand his delay. He did not have a divine calendar showing him that 13 years in slavery and prison were leading to this exact moment on this exact morning when Pharaoh's dream would create the need for exactly the kind of wisdom that exactly 13 years of suffering had produced. He simply remained faithful. He worked with integrity in Potiphar's house. He served with diligence in the prison. He kept his character intact when every circumstance would have justified letting it erode. Faithfulness became the bridge to restoration. The third thing is releasing bitterness and choosing forgiveness. Notice that Job's restoration did not come after he finally said the right theological thing or achieved some satisfactory level of spiritual composure. It came after he prayed for the friends who had wronged him, after he turned the generosity of his heart toward the very people who had added judgment to his grief, who had sat in the ashes with him and concluded that his suffering was his own fault. He prayed for them, and after he prayed for them, the Lord restored his fortunes. Joseph forgave his brothers. Not easily, perhaps, not without the grief of it, but completely. He wept when he revealed himself to them. He named what they had done. He told them the truth, that they had intended evil. And then he told them the greater truth, that God had worked through it toward good. And he fed them. He embraced them. He brought his entire family, including the very brothers who had sold him, into the abundance of the restoration he had walked into. You cannot hold on to offense and receive what God is trying to restore at the same time. The hands that are clenched around old wounds cannot open to receive new mercies. The fourth thing is trusting God's timing. This is perhaps the most costly of all the requirements, because it asks you to release the thing you want most to control. Divine restoration operates on a timeline that is not yours. This is not an arbitrary cruelty. It is a recognition that God sees things you cannot see. He knows what needs to be built in you before you are ready to carry what he is preparing to give you. He knows what circumstances need to align before the moment of restoration is complete rather than premature. He knows that a harvest offered too early is not a harvest at all. It is fruit that has not yet finished becoming what it was designed to be. But God is never late. In all the accounts of his restoration throughout Scripture, not once, not in a single case, did God arrive too late for his purposes to be accomplished. He may have arrived in what looked like the 11th hour by human calculation. He may have arrived when every observable indicator said the window had closed and the opportunity was gone and there was nothing left to save. But his timing was always exact. And the fifth thing, perhaps the most liberating of all, is this: believe that God can do more than you expect. Because the pattern of restoration in Scripture is not replacement. It is not God looking at what was taken and providing an equivalent. The pattern is multiplication. The pattern is overflow. The pattern is abundance that exceeds the most generous estimation the human imagination would dare to make. Instead of your shame, you will receive a double portion, and instead of disgrace, you will rejoice in your inheritance. And so you will inherit a double portion in your land, and everlasting joy will be yours. Isaiah 61, verse 7. Double. Not back to where you were. Not restored to your previous level. Double. And not just double in the tangible, external sense, but with everlasting joy. The deep, unshakable, interior gladness that no circumstance and no season and no loss can ultimately reach, because it flows from a source that loss cannot touch. So hear this now. Hear it not as a pleasant sentiment to comfort you through a hard season and then be forgotten. Hear it as the declaration it actually is, spoken by the most reliable voice in existence, backed by centuries of demonstrated faithfulness, offered to you specifically, in this moment, in the middle of whatever season of loss you are currently standing in. If you feel like you have lost years to a relationship that ended badly, to a career that collapsed, to an illness that took what felt like the best of your time, to choices you wish you could unmake, to circumstances that were simply and devastatingly unjust, hear this: God can restore the years. Not metaphorically, not in some vague, hard-to-define spiritual sense, in the specific, concrete, actual substance of your life, in ways that will, one day, make you stand in astonishment at what he rebuilt from what you thought was permanently lost. If you feel like your life has been delayed, like everyone around you seems to be moving forward while you have been stuck in a holding pattern, like the promises you believed have been mysteriously postponed, like the door you were sure was meant for you has remained inexplicably closed, hear this: Joseph was in prison when his moment was being arranged. The delay was not abandonment. It was preparation. And everything that needed to be in place for the fullness of the restoration to be received was being put in place during exactly the season that felt most like nothing was happening. And if there is something precious that has been taken from you, something that you cannot name in general terms, but that you carry in the most specific, personal part of your grief, something that might seem too small to ask God about, too particular to bring to the throne of the universe, hear this: God made iron float for a borrowed axe head. He made oil overflow from an empty jar for a widow's debt. He healed a withered hand in front of a hostile crowd. He does not look at your loss and calculate whether it is large enough to merit his attention. He looks at you. He sees what you are carrying. He knows what has been taken. And he is the same God today, the same yesterday, today, and forever, as the writer of Hebrews declares, who has never once been unable to restore what his purposes require to be restored. He is still in the business of restoration. Not was, not used to be, in the ancient days, when miracles were somehow more available. Is, right now, in your specific, contemporary, 21st century life, with its particular losses and its personal griefs, and its quietly desperate question of whether it is too late. It is not too late. The years that the locust has eaten are not beyond his reach. The pit you have been sitting in is not deeper than his arm is long. The prison you have been enduring is not so far from the palace that his plan cannot bridge the distance. The jar you are holding, small, insufficient, seemingly ridiculous in proportion to what you need, is not too small for his multiplication. Return to him with all your heart. Remain faithful in the process. Even when the process is longer than you expected, harder than you prepared for, darker than you believed it would be. Release every bitterness, every offense, every grievance that you have been gripping. Not because the people who wronged you deserved your forgiveness before they earned it, but because you deserve to walk into your restoration with open hands. Trust His timing. Genuinely trust it, not as a coping mechanism, not as spiritual resignation, but as confidence in a God whose track record of faithfulness across all of human history gives you every reason to believe He knows exactly what He is doing. And believe, dare to believe, with the full weight of everything you have learned about His character, that what He is preparing to restore is not going to look like what you lost. It is going to look like something you have never yet seen. Because when God restores, He does not look backward. He looks forward. He does not return you to the version of the story you were living before the loss. He advances you to the version that the loss was always preparing you to receive. Not the same. Greater. Not the beginning again. Further forward. Not a recovery. Oh, revelation. Your story is not over. The chapter you are in right now, the hard one, the one you would not have chosen, the one that has cost you more than you knew you had to give, is not the final chapter. It is not even the climax. It is the part of the story that makes the ending extraordinary. Hold on. Return. Stay faithful. Forgive. Trust. Because the God who restores years, who doubles fortunes, who redeems betrayals, who fills empty jars, who floats iron, who heals withered hands completely, that God has not finished with your story. He is, at this very moment, in the business of restoration. And yours is next. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.